Good evening. Welcome to SCI-Arc. My name is Marcelo Espina. I'm faculty here, for those of you who don't know me. I'm here to introduce Eric Bunge. Somebody asked me, is it Eric Bunge, or I know. The way you will say it in Argentina is Eric Bunge, and try to say it. I have a few kind of, few sort of information that I think is important for everyone to know about Eric and his practice with Mimi Hoang under the name of nArchitects. Most importantly, I think a kind of abbreviated intro for him is that he's born of Argentinian parents. That should be really important. And his father is a philosopher, and her mother is a mathematician. So that already says it. But anyway, Eric actually studied in McGill University and then did his master's in the GSD. He was actually a student of Wes Jones, who should be here claiming credit or otherwise. He has taught at many places, including Columbia University, which he's been teaching in the last probably like 10 years, I would say. I'd rather be inaccurate and not read, because I hate reading. But he taught at Yale, where both of them hold the Louis Kahn assistant visiting professorship, Parsons School of Design, Barnard College at Columbia, Berkeley, and the University of Toronto. nArchitects PLC have won lots of national and international awards, including the Architectural League Emerging Voices. They were, of course, one of the select group of people, two of them sit in our audience as well, of building the PS1 installation, PS1 MoMA. And now they're doing an incredible amount of work. Ongoing work includes a design Wyckoff House Museum in Brooklyn, Ellicott Park at the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus, a Pierscape at Chicago Navy Pier, and with Shane Corner Fields Operation, and more importantly, and I think this project is going to be among the ones shown tonight, the micro-housing proposal from New York City, sponsored by the New York mayor, former Mayor Bloomberg. So anyway, I could go on and on. There's lots of these things, and it's actually kind of shocking. And so, but most of it, I mean, like if you were to read the thing, you could say, these guys, they really have they have sort of a huge commitment to practice, no? And that would be not inaccurate to say. The question is it wouldn't shed a lot of light about what exactly is what they do. So this is where you go to Wikipedia, sort of a quick thing. And so Wikipedia tells about practice. There's a bunch of them. I'm not going to read them all. But the actual application or use of an idea, belief, method, as opposed to theories, this is important, such as application or use. No? Also say this is a repeated exercise, a performance of an activity or skill, of an acquired knowledge, so as to actually maintain proficiency about it. So the idea of maintaining proficiency seems interesting. The sort of performing or exercising, carry out, perform, and it gives examples, like we still practice some of these rituals today. This is the great thing about Wikipedia. It also says giving a more different example. He abandoned medical practice for church. This is funny, but I thought it would include it. Anyway, so, I mean, the whole thing about this, out of the joke is that if practice requires an a priori knowledge, in all this definition is very clear that that's really what you have at stake. And I remember there was an issue of Praxis magazine a few years back where both Eric and I had the luck to be included in that group of people. And in the context of that, this was a 11 conversation, it was called. So the idea is that architects will interview one another, and the idea was to kind of create a conversation and hopefully tease out some issues about what it was called, or was arguably some sort of generation. And discussing informally with one of the people included in that, Michael Meredith, he was arguing that the thing that characterized this group of people, so-called generation, was the idea that there was an unrelenting and uncompromising and unapologetic commitment towards practice. I don't know. I don't think, it's not an easy thing to say, and I don't think he meant it in a very direct way, but I thought I had problems with that idea. I always thought that both as a general thing, but also as our generation, that practice could not be the only thing that differentiates any kind of group, and it will not be any kind of long-lasting project emerging from it. But obviously, I myself, I'm interested and committed, and I think a lot of people are obviously committed to the idea of practice. So this was something that it was important, and it's it's just a kind of point. Recently, this was actually last week in New York, Grant Harman asked kind of a question which relates to this sort of inherent paradox between theory and practice, in many fields, but especially in architecture. He asked, and I quote, like, who's closer to knowing more about a tree? He kind of gives this sort of very, very simple example. The person who thinks about it, studies it in its ideality, writes about it, draws it, or the person who works on it, maintains it, water it, cuts it, trim it frequently. He makes the point that the real tree, he will say the tree as an object, is much larger than any combination of these two forms of engagement with it. That in fact there are qualities of the tree that are not seen in any of these two forms of relation with the tree, and they are yet intrinsic part of the tree. So yesterday we were discussing with Eric, and he was saying, like, and I quote, you know that something is real when the tolerances are down to 1/8 of an inch, And I thought this was like an interesting thing, especially if you look at the recent winning of this project in New York, the micro-housing competition. What I consider to be a really, really interesting case where they actually managed to prove, practical experience, wisdom, and also, and to do that under very kind of heavy constraint. They show a photorealistic image, which I hope they show tonight, where the project is nearing completion, and it includes like building cranes, and it includes like a crane actually putting one of these modules you'll see tonight, on top, including people there with the helmets, and it looks like it's real, and an image speaks more than 1,000 words, but I think this particular image goes further for me. It doesn't make the project seem real like a photorealistic rendering usually does. It just makes it real. Not only in its appearance, but in its practical innovation with very limited and known constraints. And I think that image, it's paradigmatic. I think in the practice of nArchitects in terms of what, as a sort of modus operandi, which it could, as an axiom, could basically say, know the constraints of your practice to get closer to a plausible, feasible, or one may even say real solution for architecture. So I think today we have the chance to see a real practicing architect at SCI-Arc. So please join me in welcome Eric Bunge to SCI-Arc.
Well, first to dispute a couple of the things you said. Mark McFay said that it's real when it's 1/8 of an inch. We've never reached that tolerance, but another thing is I often think of practice as still trying to get better, like just trying to never feel good enough. It's great to be at SCI-Arc. I've never been here before. I've long admired it, and the spirit of innovation has been an inspiration for a long time. Also, a lot of dear colleagues, and as you mentioned, a former teacher, Wes Jones, from 18 years ago. I'm going to give a lecture about an hour and 10 minutes, I hope. So if you get bored, you can leave that way. What are we really in control of? Can what we are not in control of be a positive thing? And what is invisibly controlling us? The title of my talk refers to a line of inquiry about the limit of control we have over our medium, or lack of control, and the potential for embracing a certain kind of indeterminacy. Are we even answering the right questions when we design a project? As architects, we're trained to respond to a certain set of preconceived parameters like typology, program, and site. But are these parameters always correctly formulated? There's no guarantee, for instance, that people use the space that you design in the way you think. So what does that mean about program? To what extent do we control the outcome of our work through our means of representation, fabrication, and representation fabrication? And to what extent are we already controlled by them? It's exciting for us to think about how tools change the way we think, communicate, and build, obviously. Yet with every revolution, I would argue that we become defined very soon after by the veneer of our invention, much like what happened at the turn of the century in Paris, in Europe, end of the 19th century. So we're therefore kind of suspicious in our practice about tools and techniques when they lead to an increasing sameness or a flattening of architecture to surface. And we often see this as a kind of abdication of responsibility or opportunity. But at the same time, we're critical of the idea of tools being legible in the work. We prefer it to sort of go away. But at the same time, this can be very interesting if framed critically, and one could argue that that's the definition of craft. But is it possible that many projects and theoretical projects are actually unwittingly controlled by our means of representation and fabrication, either unwittingly, I should say, or through a misplaced obsession about process? So how do we balance control and indeterminacy in our work? As architects, we necessarily work within broad and complex heterogeneous matrices, and I would say messy. We kind of embrace the messy aspect. I think you were alluding to that, Marcelo. We feel that it's always in constant need of change, this sort of condition. So the title of my talk, Control A, really refers to kind of everything, a desire to engage with complexity, but rather than to represent complexity in our work, to derive from it a kind of simple outcome. So we recognize that much lies outside of our control, whether it's the need to adapt to future technologies or users of buildings or future demographics. In the projects I'm going to show you tonight, they're basically categorized in three sort of basic themes, not chronological in any way, not according to typology. In fact, it's completely mixed. The first is conceiving of architecture that can adapt to change. Second is creating spaces of interaction between different publics. And the third is designing with conceptual and material economy. Broadly speaking, thinking about time, people, and physical things. But first, a little appetizer that will serve to kind of unpack or critique even the idea of categories, which I'm suspicious of, just so we can maintain a healthy distance from the way that we're packaging the work. It's a project that maybe it's on one level combines all three. It's an interactive wall that we did for Artist Space back in 2005. Very, very simple. At some level, it's adapting to change in the sense that we created an interactive project that has infrared sensors and responds to neighbors. It also maybe creates different relationships between different publics in that it divides the gallery into two and generates a series of conditions that are activated by neighbors. And I guess it's also kind of emblematic of our interest in conceptual material economy. We built just one object, I guess, in the middle of the room. But the reason I show it as well at the beginning is to sort of say that it's part of all these three, but no category can kind of be watertight. So basically, as you approach this wall, bands of foam move apart, creating apertures, and allowing, as we call them, neighbors to kind of interact across the gallery walls. We worked with somebody from the MIT Media Lab, and it almost didn't work. But what was interesting, and the sound doesn't seem to be on, which is kind of important. What was interesting is that it kind of became sort of a network because of the foam. We had 8 different proximity sensors with servo motors and microprocessors, limit switches, and so on. But each one would interact with the other by virtue of the fact that they're connected by foam. So at the end of the day, it responded both to external forces and to itself. So we found it interesting that we could never anticipate the level of sort of control we would have on the project. So the first topic is adapting to change, beginning with our ephemeral project, like the MoMA PS1 project that you just described, Marcelo. About 10 years ago, we've been interested in the idea of almost buildings, or buildings that are kind of incomplete in some way, or open to change. Whether climate, demographics, or other conditions, we're interested in conceptual drivers that somehow emerge from these evolving contexts. And so in the next 4 projects I'm going to show, somehow change is operated as a catalyst either for the formal or the organizational or the material strategies that we deployed. So MoMA PS1, I think you probably all know it, and it's in its 15th year now, and we have two authors here of that. It's basically yearly competition in which an architect is asked to create a space for events, but also provide a minimum set of environmental conditions, like, for instance, a little bit of shade, some lounging space, basically an urban Hamptons, if you're familiar with New York. Mimi and I had spent many years, many summers, partying basically at PS1, so we knew kind of what to expect. On a weekend, you can get up to 7,000 people listening to DJs, but at the same time, it's a contemporary art museum, so it has a kind of mixed identity, which we thought was kind of interesting. The issue we chose to focus on was really time, and the kind of transformations that happen daily with shadows, and seasonally as the bamboo that we used would turn from green to tan, and also due to the weather systems that we implemented throughout. So we built a temporary structure that stretched across the walls of the museum. I apologize, it's so faint. And when we first saw this empty, daunting space, we were kind of struck by the kind of presence of the ground, of this gravel in the sky. We decided not to build a liner on the walls, which seemed like the sort of easiest thing to do at first. But we wanted somehow to move away from the walls, and basically came up with an idea that we began to call a deep landscape. And this is the physical model, our competition entry on the top. And at the bottom you see a series of diagrams showing how within a single cohesive tectonic system we tried to unite 4 outdoor spaces, or outdoor rooms, that each of which was differentiated by a different kind of humidity, shall we say, through the use of a series of water systems, like a misting system, a fog system, and a pool. These were open to the sky, and at the same time they're sort of joined together in this sort of large network of bamboo, about 20 kilometers of bamboo, I think we used. So the basic components are just 4. Steel ring bases, which were laser cut. Weather systems, of which there were 3. The green bamboo I described. And then steel rails at the walls, the existing concrete walls. We used the tie rod holes that existed there as a kind of found condition. So during the competition, we looked for a single material that could work in compression and tension, and also meet our very tight budget. I think we're one of the, I'm not sure if I'm right to say this, but one of the few years that didn't lose money. We paid everybody, we bought our bamboo, and maybe we lost $2,000, so it was kind of not so bad. But a lot of this had to do with this incredible material that, as you can see in this little video, is basically, super ductile, strong, it's not brittle. These are 3 poles of bamboo, about 20 feet long each, lashed together. We tested on site soon after winning the competition. One of the things we were interested was that the very brevity of the project should somehow be perceivable. So in this competition image, we indicate how we thought the bamboo would change from June to September. And it did start out green, but what's kind of incredible is that by the end of its life, it was extended to sometime in October, it was almost bone white. And the weather systems also began to really operate in a very different way because of the cooler temperatures. During the project, we investigated a number of grids and rejected almost immediately the idea of a diagonal grid, because we were interested in the idea of a kind of a compressed grid where we would pinch a grid and create different densities of shadows. But it turned out that this radial grid was very good structurally, and it created very nice connections at every edge, and all the load paths were kind of, sort of good. One thing just to point out very quickly is that we also sort of braided together the bamboo, as you'll see here, around these pads to create different seating conditions, but also to make sure that people wouldn't start climbing up to kind of raise the footholds. So within 2 weeks of winning, we were on site with a few pieces of bamboo, and we kind of empirically found the appropriate curvatures, redefined our 3D models so that we would not be within the sort of bending radius that would fracture the bamboo. And we inflated the project from the competition. It became a lot taller, a lot more sort of vaulted. The one thing the engineer Arab told us, after he told us, don't do it with bent bamboo, I can't calculate it, use rods and cables, which we weren't interested in. He said, all right, if you're going to do it, think of it as a soap bubble. So we kind of inflated it. So first thing we did was complete the steel, bring it to site, and which establishes the geometry. And then we ordered the bamboo from Dudley, Georgia. 1,100 poles of Philostachys aria bamboo that range in diameter from about 1.5 or 1 inch to about 2 inches at the base, and they're about 20 feet tall. there's Mimi with a very coveted job because it was so hot that we would fight to get a chance to water the bamboo. It was the only cool place. This, in fact, made a evaporative cooling fridge. We found ice in August on the sort of rods of bamboo. So the project was comprised of a series of basic arcs, parabolic arcs that span from base to base, and half parabolas that span from base to ring wall to the ring beam at the top, and then a series of secondary arcs that span between them. This was the kind of sort of drawing we used on site. Basically, the whole project was built with 300 sections marked. We would have to mark essentially the sort of coordinate and sort of match it all together using two different splices, a kind of a node connection and a splice connection. And it took us about 7 weeks to build it with a series of students and recent grads. It kind of worked. We had to establish a kind of construction sequence with primary sort of structure first and secondary afterwards. And one person in our office was almost daily generating drawings like this for the next phase as we kind of like encountered, what to do. Again, it's very faint. So towards the end, you can see here our underwater furniture pool and the thing coming together. We replaced 3,000 zip ties with stainless steel wire, which made it a lot stronger. And the final result, our sort of objective was that it could kind of be understood in a crowd of 7,000, but also work when it's almost empty on a Sunday. And this maybe brings up the point about program. We sort of anticipated how people might use some of these spaces. The space on the lower part of the screen, we call it the fog pad. And in our animations for the competition, we showed people dancing there, and that did sort of happen. But what was interesting more to us throughout the summer was to be a sort of fly on the wall and see how the space was appropriated by people in ways that we could never have imagined. And in fact, somebody once pushed me off something and said, "Hey, buddy," and I felt like, "Oh, this is not not ours anymore." So, 2 years after PS1, we were invited to build an installation in the south of France. And one thing we were interested in pursuing in PS1 was the mobility and the wind of the canopy. So we built 2 pavilions that basically respond to the wind. We're interested in some idea of a dynamic architecture that doesn't try to resist the wind through rigidity, that doesn't let the wind pass through it, but in fact kind of moves with it. And one of our biggest regrets is that we don't have any film documenting this. The filmmakers who were there promised to take footage and just never did. But it was kind of interesting how it moved. So it's in La Coste in the south of France, which is famed for being the site of the Marquis de Sade's castle. And this kind of inspired us to think about the pavilions as kind of fictional extensions of what might have been there. 2 pavilions that extended the sort of fortress of the town. But in a sort of homage to Sade, inverted that with a kind of feather. So basically created a very light condition that extended the heavy. So the project refers in its exterior form to the sort of hewn limestone of the village, but in its an interior form and the dynamic aspects of the landscape that we're trying to hearken to. So in the end, the system was a kind of interdependent structural network comprised of tripods, quite basically, that would stack with a set of aluminum nodes that we had built. And we built this as well, this one with some students, and had to develop our own kind of construction system because we were quite far away. We only had 6 weeks to build this. And like most of our installations, it almost failed at the last minute. But eventually, it worked out. So the third project in this first theme of adapting to change is a little bit different, but it's about adapting to weather. Some of you might have heard of the Ordos 100 project in Inner Mongolia, China. It was curated by Herzog and de Meuron and master planned by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. We were asked to design a 10,000 square foot house, which we sort of thought obscene, and we're one of 100 architects given a lot through lottery, lot 89. What struck us, other than the fact that it was sort of obscene at the scale, was the extreme range of temperature swings in the desert from -4 Fahrenheit to 86 Fahrenheit. And so what we developed was an idea of sort of living in between the insulation, as it were, and to create a kind of smaller house that fits sort of within the larger house that would have what you need, essentially, is heated, insulated, conditioned, horizontal views out of windows, but only 60% of the volume. And then outside that was the outer house, which was insulated, but only passively heated, and no views, no windows, just skylights. So this layering responded to the extreme swings in the climate and sort of an idea of efficiencies, but it also responded to an idea of expanding the way you live and living in different ways according to the seasons. We developed a thermal model with Arup and then exhibited in the Seoul Design Olympiad this model, which is a kind of 1 to 7.5 scale model of the building, but as a kind of thermal model. What you see here are these stickers, which show in blue on the ground a minus 20 degrees Celsius condition outside. And then in yellow and orange, you see the kind of interior comfortable temperature. The green shows the sort of acceptable temperature that you could sort of be okay with a sweater or a light jacket, but no wind. So the outer house, works as a kind of semi-outdoor space. It's very bright. But the building is comprised of 3 stacked volumes, the inner house, each of which respond to different kind of program conditions, but all of them superimpose on 4 columns. So we use parametric models to align these 3 and to minimize the depth of beams so that it could also be economical. So the first floor is sort of a guest floor, inner house inside the outer house. The second floor is the sort of living floor, you live in the round. And the third floor is a series of 4 bedrooms. And each of these basically meet the exterior perimeter and puncture through. Meanwhile, and inside the inner house, you have views to the outside, but also views to this semi-outside, which is an outer house. And in the outer house, we thought it was a very rough, just kind of painted white brick, like some of Ai Weiwei's galleries. And top light, we cheated with 1 window to the garden, to a lot of debate. But these kind of funny little adjacencies between the inner and the outer house created a series of spaces that allowed people to adapt to the weather. Marcelo just mentioned the micro unit project. Very different project, super constrained. We were approached by this developer, Monadnock Development, to join this competition launched by Mayor Bloomberg's administration in 2012, and we won it in 2013. It's on a very, very small site. The sort of challenge in this project, in a sense, was to sort of meet the brief and at the same time create a kind of new pilot or prototype that's somehow generic and systemic, as we saw it. At the turn of the 20th century, Jacob Riis documented the plight of the urban poor and the sort of lack of sanitation and the horrific crowding that was occurring. And this kind of shocked the city's civic leadership in the ensuing decades to enact a series of housing reforms, which basically looked at, set new legal standards for light and air and health and safety. But paradoxically, meanwhile, housing sizes, the size of an average apartment has increased almost 200%, has doubled since the end of the Second World War, from about 1,000 square feet to about 2,500 square feet just before the crash in 2007. And the problem here is that actually only 18% of New Yorkers are actually comprised of nuclear families. So about half of New Yorkers actually live alone. So there's an incredible discrepancy between the housing stock and the sort of demographics that the city is trying to correct. And you'll see that this is, not just in Manhattan, but in fact, much of the developed world is looking like this more and more. And this has to do with a series of socioeconomic factors, some of which have to do with, we're living longer, we're divorcing more, we're marrying later. Women, since the Second World War, of course, have been studying, obtaining education a lot more, and so on. So the less and less families, essentially. So right now, the sort of options people have, other than moving to the suburbs, is to live in a kind of cramped apartment, perhaps with no window, or to move to the suburbs. So the city started this research program called Making Room, and based on that, launched the Adapt NYC competition, which tried to sort of solve this problem. So there we are, winning it in January. Within a few weeks, we had to kind of start the project. This winning proposal, we thought of it as a kind of, as I said before, sort of systemic and generic prototype. So we chose the most generic material we could find in New York, which is brick. There are also super tight economic constraints that we have to work within. But also something that could be built very, very quickly and reflect the sort of nested scales we think that if somebody living alone needs to kind of live within. So we rejected from the beginning this idea of the kind of metabolist idea of connecting the domestic scale to the industrial by expressing the individual in stacking boxes, like for instance Habitat or some of the Japanese experiments, and thought instead, people will live in a unit, but they sort of have to live in different scales at the same time. And the expression of the project really kind of celebrates the beauty maybe of small dimensions, but really kind of tries to integrate people across these scales. And to the point that we're kind of expanding the notion of a house throughout the building with a series of public amenities and connecting the units to the street with very, very large sliding glass doors, 8-foot doors. Sometimes when you want to make something bigger, you divide it into something even smaller, which is what we are doing with the units. We're dividing them into two very small areas, each one defined by kind of a different material treatment. And we're building these in a factory near our office in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. This is not our project, but this is the factory. Here you see the kind of the unit configuration. Even though it's modular, we've been able to create a sort of range of different types a little bit. This is the rendering that Marcelo was referring to, which probably helped win the competition, but we tried to imagine how the sort of the construction of it would unfold, and also how it might become a kind of emblem of the project, the fact that we thought we could do it, we could pull it off. So we have two sites to visit, the site right now with the foundations and the site with the factory. There you see our first module, the prototype module that has to meet 1/8 of an inch tolerance. So my second topic is, or theme, is the interaction between different publics. The various publics we designed for, and the capacity for architecture to instigate some kind of social interaction outside of the programmatic scripts we've been given, in other words, outside programs. If one considers a client to be synonymous with an end user, I think one misses out on all the unanticipated uses, or what we've come to call the misusers, as we like to call them. So in the next 5 projects I'm going to show you, each one is somehow disobedient, in that each one is based, well, it didn't follow the brief exactly, but each one is also based on sort of a central idea that emerged from a desire to foster the human interaction and resulted in a space not in the brief. In 2008, we were asked to design an exhibition at the Drawing Center of Friedrich Kiesler, the famous Austrian architect and designer, now famous for his endless house and amongst other things. Philip Johnson once labeled him the most well-known non-practicing architect of our time, speaking of practice. The challenge we set ourselves was to somehow resonate with some of his ideas, but while avoiding pastiche, which I hope we did. 3 of these salient ideas were his interest in endless space. The second one was co-realism, or correlations between things are more important than the things themselves. And the third major interest of his was that perception was a constantly immutable construct. So he was always designing displays that one had to kind of lift a veil or bend in a certain way. So we designed a 145-foot long table that snaked around the gallery, organizing the collection into a series of regions. And it was the first time that the gallery didn't have anything on the walls. We insisted that there should be nothing on the walls because we were interested in the void in the middle and having people sort of look at each other across the sort of charged void, and also that the experience should unfold in a way that is a little bit surprising, even though it's linear. So as people wander around the 145 feet, they encounter a series of tilting panels that accommodate some of the larger drawings and also create a sense of surprise, and come close to each other and then further away. And finally, on the opening, and we're really glad people in New York wear black because it sort of worked with the white. You understand in the sense that you can't sort of access this void, but you see people across it. Now, 7 years after PS1, we finally resisted the potential label of being bamboo architects, and we decided to use bamboo again in Taiwan, where it seemed to make sense. We were asked to build an installation in eastern Taiwan, in Hualien, and we decided, as we usually do, to try to make something more of a space, something that could serve the people as much as we could. The context was an arts festival that was trying to sort of raise awareness about President Ma's initiative to lower Taiwan's carbon footprint and protect a new forest. So when we learned more about the indigenous people in the East, they're called the Amis. There are many different tribes. They're not sort of Han Chinese. We decided to make a polycentric theater that would allow them to tell their stories through dance and so on. And but the site was quite daunting. Again, nothing on the ground. Just 6 or 8 weeks before opening, it was like this. They did everything. They made a road. They planted grass, built our project. So basically, it's comprised of 11 vaults, 11 curved vaults. Each one is different, and they brace each other, and they're braced by this ring, which creates a void in the center. And each vault is a kind of a theater. At the same time, it kind of connects to views of the landscape. And once again, we use bamboo, and by virtue of curving the vaults, it has resisted a couple of years of typhoons. It was a project intended only to last a summer, but it's been up for the last few years. They've sort of kept it up. You see a plan which you can't see. So the first step was to dig a few holes after surveying it and create a sort of set of steel pipe foundations, which look a bit like mortars, I think. The bamboo was harvested just right nearby, in the hills nearby. They built it from our drawings, and we were kind of surprised that it actually happened. So here you see on the photo by Yuan Ban of the festival just about to begin. The ring in the center, we imagined it could be either a stage or sort of a space in between. And in the end, we were excited to see that people appropriated it in a way we hadn't anticipated. The ring became both stage and seating. So we began to be interested in this idea of sort of polycentric theater, not a single fixed point of view, and maybe not really structuring or controlling the way people might use it. Just very briefly, this recent project we just finished, the Joan Mitchell Foundation in New York. It's a 6,000 square foot renovation of a former public library, sort of second floor. The client, as usual, had too much program, not enough space. But they didn't like the idea of overlapping program either. So we proposed this idea of a sort of active void that could be, with perimeter of other uses, that could be activated by a series of rotating panels hinged on these aluminum poles. We were very influenced by Sir John Soane's museum. I was just saying to Hernan, which I did my thesis on, I sort of created a virtual double of Soane back at the GSD. And basically, we created this liner with a series of possible configurations from small pin-up spaces. I forgot to mention it's arts education space for young adults. A small gallery, an auditorium for 80 people, or just open. So these series of photos from 4 vantage points, which we just took, just shows how the space can kind of interact. And these are a little bit staged. We want to go back and actually see how it works. So another project that sort of considers different publics and the sort of use of this is the Wyckoff House Museum, which has been on our board since 2011. We have landmarks preservation approval. We finished construction drawings. We're just stuck in a huge bureaucratic knot with the Department of Parks and other agencies. But this project basically is adjacent to the oldest house in New York State, the Wyckoff House, part of which dates from 1652. And it's designed as a kind of visitor center that combines a gallery and a small gift shop and some administration and a sort of community room. This part of Brooklyn used to be the breadbasket of America before the train lines were implemented. And now the site is really just a little triangle right here, surrounded by auto body shops and high traffic. The house itself is quite beautiful. It's been restored to its 1819 condition. It had been added to many times. So we decided to place the building at the corner in such a way that one really didn't have to go to the building at all. And in such a way also that it would frame views of the existing house and celebrate it. And I think this allowed us to get it past landmarks. The house, the original house, is the first project that the Landmarks Preservation Commission designated as a landmark in New York City upon their formation in 1968. So it was a very sensitive thing. So the Department of Parks was very happy we managed to get their approval. One kind of trick was to kind of tell them that the house is based on this cabinet inside the building, rather, was based on this cabinet inside the house. And the way that the Dutch use very sparingly very expensive pigments like orange in sort of interiors. So we're inspired by that, and also maybe a little bit by Alice in Wonderland, to create this kind of house that functioned as a portal. And we saw it as a portal really between the past and the future in some ways. So one enters through this covered portal, which wasn't in the program, but they needed it because the Wyckoff House Association every summer would put up a tent and for all kinds of activities, school groups and musical activities and so on. And so now we found a way to sort of create ambiguously two buildings that are really one, near each other in the same way that barn buildings used to be next to each other, and yet united with a single roof like this, which collects all of the water into a single point, where we created a 3-foot wide rain chase. And we tested it with water, so it works. So crossing the street, you basically get a view through the portal, and as you enter, you see the black zinc of the perimeter, which is sort of barn-like, and the orange terracotta of the interior. You see the house, and then looking back, you see the sort of more subdued side of our building. We hope to start construction next year. A little bit briefly, another project on the boards is in Columbia, Maryland. And like the last project, it also, again, is defined by a space not in the brief that also allows you to pass through the building without if you don't want to go in it. In this case, over the building. Our building is has a modest function. It's just a guest concession building, and it's in between Frank Gehry's Merriweather Post Pavilion from 1968, where Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix played, and Mark Foran's new Chrysalis amphitheater. And it occupies a hill in between the two, sort of strategic importance. So we decided that it's an opportunity to create a kind of a view to the two of them and allow people to go in and go to the restaurants and the little gallery and bathrooms if they choose, but also go over the building, climb up onto the top and back down again. And so the roof is now going to become a kind of a performance space in its own right, with bleachers and so on, and a bar, and a little office. Of course, the client decided that's where they want their office. Another thing we're trying to do is engage with the forest by building very close to the trees. So we're doing this by cantilevering over the ground, creating a smaller foundation and creating basically some grade beams that allow us to project our building closer to the critical root zone. Because if you get too close to a tree and cut the roots, it'll die. And it's also very hard to install tree protection and build around trees. So a third way we're trying to engage with the context, in a sense, is to mess with it. So we're using curved mirrored surfaces that'll somehow multiply and replicate the forest. Here you see the stair leading up, and you'll emerge down onto the other side. So my third and last topic is to think about a conceptual and material economy, which is sort of how we started. In all these projects, we're trying to maintain some level of control over our physical and organizational aspects of the work, often in the face of seemingly unsurmountable obstacles. Every project hits a crisis where we really think it's not going to happen, and it's happening like every day. So we're kind of finding that we have to kind of pick our battles. But on the other hand, we're sort of also conceptually and ethically interested in the idea of doing more with less, and reducing our palette of materials and formal strategies to the absolute minimum that can get the maximum effect. At the same time, we're hoping that this will achieve some kind of richness of experience with an economy of means. So we're absolutely not interested in minimalism. It's more about the issue of narrowing the spectrum of innovation strategically, so that every project innovates in some way, but also uses tried and tested practice where we can. Just so we can kind of keep on learning and keep on this is practicing, Marcelo. This is like trying to practice. But so it's also, I think, the product of having two partners. My partner Mimi and I will never let any sort of idea that either of us considers weak or frivolous to pass through. So we're kind of always stuck in this reductivist model, I guess, in some ways. Around the same time that we built Canopy, we were approached by the client for our first building, our first ground-up building, the Switch building in Manhattan. This is 10 years ago now. He had a wish list that's typical of all developers. I want bay windows, balconies, wine fridge, stainless steel facade, all this stuff, but it was kind of a checklist. And we kind of tried to find a way to unite these into something more cohesive. Meanwhile, he'd already obtained a permit. This is us on site after meeting him 2 days after we met him. He'd obtained a permit and was already building the foundation. So we had to very quickly place the elevator core and design the building in 3 weeks. Back then, things seemed a lot simpler when we didn't know very much. Our main kind of approach was to sort of think about the facade as something that you could inhabit and connect to the street. Partly because we were thinking that the Lower East Side, which is where this is situated, was rapidly gentrifying, and we felt that a lot of these new condos were just kind of hermetically sealed and disconnected and set back. Actually, that's Bernard Tschumi's blue building, just 2 houses down. We started construction before his finished earlier, believe it or not. It's like David and Goliath. And so these bay windows project in and out and allow you to view up and down the street. It's something that has existed for a long time in the Lower East Side, but is no longer allowed since the enactment of the street wall laws. Another thing that's sort of indicative of developer housing is the PTAC unit. Maybe you don't have these so much in LA, but it's the bane of development in New York. It's like a rash all over these buildings, these kind of identical little punctured things. But we had to use them. That was in the budget. So you can't see it, but we developed a cladding system that would kind of breathe like the gills of a fish, and got the manufacturers of the units to okay the way we were separating air, exhaust, and intake into these panels that we then incorporated into the Galvalume cladding. We didn't have money for stainless steel. So we just used Galvalume and used the kind of switching idea at the level of the material as well as at the sort of level of you know, the form. And this concept of switching started extending to the back. We started doing the same thing with the balconies, thinking that we would, in fact, allow people to communicate with each other and also maybe provide a sort of more generous feeling of space in the balconies. And 2 sisters actually moved in. These are their bicycles. We didn't stage this photo. Now, sort of in the spirit of trying to do more with less, we really had to maintain very sort of repetitive floor plates, but we tried to make each apartment different by virtue of the way that the light conditions would be different relative to the bay windows and balconies location. And it's sort of a inexpensive building, $300 a square foot. At the ground floor, the client wanted to make an art gallery. So within the 25 feet of width, which is really tight, we had to incorporate an egress door from the cellar, an entry door for the residential lobby, and the storefront for the gallery. And everything was handmade. We didn't buy anything from any system. It was all like hot rolled steel doors, hot rolled steel cladding with a sandblasted steel fascia, and then the Galvalume. It was all rough, and it was built by a builder who had never built a building, a metal guy who had only done stairs, and us who had never done a building either on our own. And the client had never done a building. So actually that's the recipe for success. So he let us do whatever we wanted. So here you see we're fitting absolutely everything and trying to make the most out of every little condition, even the flue. Well, maybe we can create a space for art on the flue rather than have an ugly bump out, and et cetera, all these sorts of things. The residential lobby is super small. These are actually 2 photos. So we wrapped it in a ply brick throughout and then used cold rolled steel and back painted glass to create some kind of feeling of a tube. And then the gallery had to be very rough, super cheap. So we used this material that's used as a substrate. It's a kind of a fire-resistant replacement for plywood. It's called VersaRock. And just to eke out a little bit more space, we angled it between the beams, also to create a sort of a gradient of light towards the back. And we convinced the client to cut a hole so we could have a 2-story gallery, because in the Lower East Side, there really isn't that scale. A project on the boards right now is a building for a developer. It's in Calgary and the East Village, which is a sort of new emerging area on the Bow River. It's a lot of ugly condominiums, but also an old building. We're right next to it. That's not our design. That's kind of the showcase model. We haven't given them our model yet. But it's a very difficult site, and this is probably why our young developer managed to secure it. It has no front or back. It has a really strange shape. And by law, we're not allowed to cast a shadow closer to this line, and this is the north. So one thing you can notice is that the buildings get smaller and smaller as they get towards the river. So given this sort of shadow encroachment rule, we developed a parametric model that would allow us to test different envelopes and finally convince the city that we could build something that would only encroach a little bit. So the sort of zigzagging form pretty much comes out of this equation, I guess. The rest of the buildings along the coast will look like a sort of Mayan Riviera because they all have this kind of ziggurat shape. So what we're trying to do with this restaurant and office building is create a series of spaces for events, these platforms that are a little bit interconnected and have sort of great views to the river. So it's in design development right now, And I guess one thing that's exciting is that this Riverwalk has just been built, so it's a brand new space. This bridge has also just finished completion by RFR from France, and it's connecting to this sort of nature reserve. So it's an exciting new area of Calgary to build in. Since the lot is so small, we had to put our egress stair on the facade, and we've seen that as an opportunity to maybe bring in some light and make it a nicer stair. It's also a building that's going to create a kind of a connection from the city to the waterfront. So with this cantilever, we're creating a little bit of a kind of I guess, a gate. Now, in 2008, we were approached for a small limited competition to redesign this kind of identity and facades of Beirut's premier department store, the ABC department store. And we won maybe partly because we made a sort of a veil that used the client's logo thousands of times. Mainly because we didn't want to have their logo on the building, so we kind of tried to convince them that if you have a veil made of the logo, you don't need a logo. They put a logo anyway. So this is Beirut. This is the green line across which the civil war was fought. You have the Sunni Muslims are here, and this is Ashrafia, where the Christians are. And ABC is in Dubai, which is also kind of a Christian enclave. It's on the main north-south Mediterranean highway. The project started out simply enough as a kind of like recladding of this, but it grew halfway through the project, and I'll get to that in a minute, doubled in scale from 200,000 square feet to 450,000 with a kind of an addition on top. So the existing building looked like this, and what we did ended up looking a bit like this, partly because we were right up against lot lines, and this had to be as low as possible, but it's a multiplex cinema, and this we tried to make as tall as possible so we could unite the whole thing and not make it look like a huge addition. But this all came a little bit later. At first, our objective was to create a kind of a laser-cut aluminum screen that would mitigate heat gain on the facade, which actually was a serious issue because of their air conditioning loads, and it's one of their program objectives. Again, using the logo, but using a sort of a gradient that operated in many different ways to create a different perception as you move around. So this blue shows the depth of the facade, which ranged from 60 centimeters to about 1.5 meters, which allowed for a series of displays and different kind of backlit conditions and connections to existing windows we had to maintain, and a new outdoor roof with outdoor restaurants. So the system was comprised of the original masonry building with a new kind of insulation and plaster, and then light gauge framing, and then this is just a mock-up. It's just indicating a new layer of cementitious fiberboard, and then a system of prefabricated struts which supported these bigger modules, which are kind of bolted together. That's the logo we had. Oh, you can't even see it. Well, that's the logo we were forced to put in, but it's comprised of 1,000 little LEDs puncturing through the aluminum screen, so it becomes more evident at night. They also asked us to put in like these recesses for big advertising and so on, but we really were trying to resist the commercialism of malls, basically. Here you see the project under construction, and then when it was completed, right across the highway. So the gradient is not just accidental. We were working with photometrics. Since it's backlit by these LED projectors along the bottom and the top, we realized that you really get a drop-off in the light attenuation very quickly with a small cavity, even though these new projectors can really shoot really high. But after some experiments, we realized that it's counterintuitive, but by diminishing the holes to where you have the lowest light levels, you increase the contrast. So we were able to create the illusion of a more uniform lighting effect through the kind of, the allocation of the size of the hole. It works better at night and less so in sort of dusk. But here you see one of the entrances we designed. There are 4 of these, and they kind of act as like mini theaters. We really couldn't puncture through the old 1940s masonry building that much, but we tried to create the illusion of transparency where we could. And that extended to the west side, which is really kind of uninhabitable highway, but we created a big display for artists. We didn't design the installation inside, but we provided the space for it. It's a 200-foot long kind of glass gallery, and the client was pretty surprising. We thought they would put mannequins and bicycles and Christmas presents, but they decided no, it's just a space for art. And this entire load of this facade had to be transferred to the back to create this column-free condition. We didn't even want glass fins, so we just sized the glass to an inch thick so that we could resist the wind load. It's 4-meter tall glass. And here you see one of the typical entrances in the daytime. So now to the crux of the story. So halfway through project, as I mentioned before, they told us we had to design the rest of the project. They suddenly doubled, but there was no budget. We'd spent all their budget on this first part. So, well, we spent the budget they gave us. They just didn't have any more money. But so they told us it had to be in situ concrete, and there was no money for anything else. So we kind of thought about it and said, well, we have all this waste from all the cutouts. So we have thousands of them, and they're all documented, and in fact, they're already numbered because we already cleverly, not even knowing it, but had put sort of in the toolpath, some sort of numbering system. So we convinced the client that we could just bolt this to the concrete and paint the concrete black, and it sort of worked. And in fact, in the end, this really shoddy concrete work started to look like a Phoenician ancient ruin, and we were kind of happy with it. This is the last project. So in 2012, we won a competition along with James Corner Field Operations to renovate Chicago Navy Pier. This is a kind of glitzy competition. No, this is actually after the competition. But it shows some of our scope. As the architects on the team, we are building a series of objects or pavilions. There's a little information tower, a series of what we call lake pavilions, and this 500-foot long, what we call wave wall, which is a 30,000 square foot retail environment that has a huge stair on axis with this existing Ferris wheel. The pier is strange. It's kind of like a sushi platter with many different sushi, ugly buildings and things, and some really nice, bookended by some historic buildings. It's a significant place in a way. It's the most visited place in the state of Illinois. That's one distinction. But originally it was part of Burnham's plan for Chicago. There were meant to be more of these. And it was lovingly called the People's Pier at first, but then it was appropriated by the Navy, and so now it's called Navy Pier. But it's hosted many things, universities and so on. It's a really tacky place, and this is one of the things that the competition was trying to address, really to sort of transform it. Basically, people go there to go on rides, to ride on boats, eat hot dogs, and you can drink alcohol walking along this. So it's public space, but it's sort of outside of the rule of law in some ways. Once again, this is a little bit hard to see, but so our work is spread all across, and the reason I'm putting in the category of conceptual economy, I guess, is that we're trying to figure out how do you address such a large sort of stretch, a 3,000-foot long pier, and maintain some kind of cohesion or some kind of legibility with our interventions. So these are the kinds of things we're doing: the information tower, the lake pavilions, a series of many, many little kiosks, the wave wall, and now we're in phase 2, designing this tilt-up landscape welcome pavilion. So I'll just show a couple of them. There's a little information tower, which is like a model Chicago building. It's almost complete. It's only 40 feet tall, but it looks like a really tall skyscraper. And if you stand in a certain direction, it looks like Jeannie Gang, as tall as Jeannie Gang's building. But it's comprised of a series of different kinds of glass with different properties, different amount of reflectivity kind of disappears, and it kind of greets you at the front. They'd asked us to put an archway, a kind of a gate, and we really resisted that because we thought that would create a sense of enclave, and also reminds one of like bad parts of history. Thinking of the Arbeit macht frei, maybe. Just this idea of like defining a space and making it kind of feel like something that you pass through. So luckily we didn't have to do that. In the brief, we had to sort of provide many kiosks. There are dozens of them practically for different things, but we thought there's just too much clutter, so we proposed to unite them with a kind of a canopy for unanticipated events, but also to address the shade. And this canopy will be, the underside of the canopy will be reflective. We're using a kind of mirrored material. It used to have double curvature, but we've had to sort of simplify it. And this reflective material will basically bounce the light from the lake up onto the canopy and back down again. And so providing a kind of dynamic connection to the lake, which is one of the sort of things we're trying to do in all our interventions. These three guys are next to a misting pole, so we've kept that from PS1. It's going to have the same fog nozzles. It's going to be emitting mist before you go on the boat. So the wave wall, the last thing I'm going to show you, is the 500-foot long plinth that exists. We extended it by about 30 feet, and we addressed the brief, which was to allow for handicap access to get to the top. All our competitors had shown ramps, and we decided that ramps are just, nobody really, ramps look great in section, but you're always moving, you're not stopping. we thought that actually, what if we create a theater, a space to stop and actually add some value so that the people using the retail and so on can use it, but also maybe other things can happen. And that we can simply solve ADA with some elevators. So that was okay. In the competition, the idea was really to push the lake in and push the pier out. We lost one of these. We were down to just one wave, but at least we got one in. But basically, it's a kind of a morphing between two things, a stair and a facade, or an overlook. So a series of stair stringers basically begin rotating so that they produce a series of conditions ending up in a very flat fascia all along its length. So here you see the typical fascia condition as it begins to become an outlook, projecting over, getting you closer to the water, and then shifting back again when it starts touching the ground, becoming a stair, and then becoming in the middle, crucially, a regulation stair for egress. So we were able to convince them not to have any sort of egress stairs from this huge plinth that has lots of people. So it will, and maybe this is idealized, but it will kind of look like this. And James Corner's landscape is going to be much more green and much more kind of engaging than what was there. It's almost done. So this is from a couple of months ago, showing the construction. Now I realize that the screen's cut. I didn't realize this whole time. But anyway, it's showing you how the stair will begin to transform. Seen from below, there's a retail space that Gensler is doing, but their space is going to look through our stair, which is kind of veil-like, allowing for some views to the lake. We managed to get it on axis with a Ferris wheel, so that in case the Ferris wheel falls off, it'll just roll into the lake. They managed to open a central section of it for July 4th, kind of incredibly, because it was incomplete just 2 weeks prior. But it shows you how every step's illuminated and kind of porous, so you'll have this sort of sense of transparency. The exciting parts are where the stair touches the ground and sort of transitions from being a stair to a louver. All the pieces are being fabricated as modules in Wisconsin and will be shipped on a truck, actually really soon, in the next month or two. This is where we are now. The stair is comprised of curved Ipe wood and looks due south. What we hope to do is provide Chicago with a new kind of public space that will connect its citizens to the lake. So since 1999, my partner Mimi and I started our practice at the end of '99, and we lucked out in our first competition. Did a couple more, gravitating towards real commissions and rather than ideas competitions. And at the same time, we started with small art-type installations because we're committed to building our ideas however we could, however many mistakes there are in them. We don't care. We just want to be messy and just move forward, practice. So since 2000, we've tried to address a wide range of scales in our work, from buildings and interiors and installations in the public realm. Regardless of scale, the question that we ask are always the same, roughly the ones I presented tonight. We're concerned less about aesthetic or formal consistency than about consistency in approach and whether we're really contributing to the city and culture at large. So at the end of PS1, the artist Matthew Barney offered to buy our bamboo, which helped us with our $2,000 deficit. That's about as much as he paid for us. And he used it in a film to create a scaffolding. What really surprised us was that after 5 months of conforming to the controlled geometry of curves, it returned to its original state absolutely flat. And we warned him it's going to, it's all going to be bent, but it's just flat. So, in fact, what are we really in control of? The way in which we formulate the design problem, scaling and situating our ambition for each project well, the critical leveraging of our production tools. The list of what controls us and our work is too long and depressing to get into. Somewhere in between are the moments where we happily relinquish control, i.e., the multiple interpretations and misuses of our environments, the varying relationship between our work and its environment or inhabitants, and the productive influence of fluctuating external conditions. This ultimately is where we try to aim our efforts. Thank you.